How you doing? This year has been a good year to be a Batman fan, all things considered. Earlier this year, we finally saw the release of Batman Caped Crusader, and right now, the Penguin is currently going on one of the best runs in television in 2024. But obviously, if you look at the title of this video, it is Batman Caped Crusader that I want to talk about today because this is a really interesting project in my opinion. It is a show that has been in development for a while now, since 2021. It was announced that Matt Reeves, the director of The Batman, would be producing this show along with Bruce Timm, and it seemed to have a lot of excitement. But unfortunately, it struggled to find a distributor because Max was offloading a lot of projects at that time, and thankfully it found one in Prime Video, so we were finally able to watch Batman Caped Crusader. However, the show was released in early August, and at that time I was consuming hours upon hours of Olympic coverage, and there was no way in hell I was going to stop watching the best thing in sports to watch Caped Crusader. I know that's crazy considering I'm such a big Batman fan, but it's the truth. But I have watched all of Batman Caped Crusader and I liked it. I thought it was a good Batman show and it was bordering on greatness at times. So you can imagine my surprise when I go online and I see the reaction. I thought this was a pretty normal Batman show. It is an animated show that is introducing the character to a new generation of audiences, and it's pretty good. Surely people are excited for this. What I ended up seeing was a bunch of stuff calling Caped Crusader a woke disaster. I saw a thumbnail that said something like the DEI night, and I just really found myself wondering, why are people being so weird about a TV show? Why are people like this? Because the truth is, I think Batman Caped Crusader is a good show, and it's certainly a worthwhile watch. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. I think the show has some issues, but to say that it's just this disaster that appears to be a disgrace to the Batman legacy and fails to understand the character, I think is simply not true. And my entire mission for starting a YouTube channel, my mission still to this day, despite the fact that I'm not that consistent with YouTube, is to try and bring level-headed, nuanced discussion to these things, because we just don't see it enough. Before I break everything down, I just want to get something out of the way real quick, because this is a discussion that plagues almost every single Batman media that has come out since Batman the Animated Series, which is, it is okay for another actor to voice Bruce Wayne. I really don't know where this comes from, because we all love Kevin Conroy. Everybody recognizes his talent and what he brought to the role, but this weird toxic attitude that the Batman fandom has towards anybody else voicing Batman, in my opinion, it's getting out of hand, and quite frankly, it's a little frustrating because they act like no one else should be voicing this character, and every other actor that takes on the role is just sort of disgracing the role, and I don't agree with this at all. I think there have been plenty of great Batman voices. Bruce Greenwood, Roger Craig Smith, Jason O'Mara, and even Will Arnett have all done a fantastic job voicing the character of Bruce Wayne and Batman. I had no hang-ups about Hamish Linklater taking on the role here. I was excited to see what he would do, because In my opinion, Hamish Linklater is a very talented and underrated actor. He delivered what was, in my opinion, one of the best performances I've ever seen in a TV show or a movie in Midnight Mass, which came out in 2021 as well, which was created by Mike Flanagan. That performance blew me away. So I was excited to see what he could do by bringing his talents to such an iconic role. And the second half of this disclaimer is just to say that it is okay that this show is not Batman the Animated Series. We all love BTAS. I get it. I'm a Batman fan. Everybody knows that by now. And I cherish that show. I have the collector's edition Blu-ray box set. But I am okay with other iterations of an animated Batman existing. So with all of that unpleasantness out of the way, let's finally get into it. Batman Caped Crusader is, as I said at the beginning, a really interesting show, because I think it very much wants to evoke the spirit of Batman the Animated Series, but it is clearly not a true successor or even an evolution of Batman the Animated Series. It's not something that was made in the same vein as X-Men 97. Rather, I think Caped Crusader wants to evoke the feeling of BTAS. It wants to give you the impression. It wants to give off the vibe. And I think this is most apparent in the show's aesthetic. Caped Crusader adopts this same 1940s anachronistic look, which gives everything this really tiny, pulpy feeling. And I really like that. All of the technology in Caped Crusader is extremely analog, but at the same time, there are several indicators throughout the show that suggest it's not actually the 1940s, because in my opinion, the 1940s aesthetic of Batman Caped Crusader is just that, an aesthetic. It's not committing to that time period. It's not saying the show explicitly takes place in the 1940s. So when characters use modern slang or language, or we see more diverse representations of people, it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't catch me off guard. It doesn't feel out of character with what's being presented here in the show, because I'm able to take it for what it is, which is a creative choice. It is not an Elseworlds type story where we are saying this takes place in the 1940s and we're going to make that clear by referencing World War II or other time-appropriate references. Batman Caped Crusader is a new Batman story, and it is very clear because we have a new voice cast. This is a new interpretation of the character. And one thing that I thought was particularly interesting about Caped Crusader is that in many ways it acts as a companion piece to the Batman. I think there are a lot of thematic parallels with the Batman and Caped Crusader here, most notably the way that Bruce Wayne is portrayed in Caped Crusader. We see Bruce Wayne as a very angry, traumatized young man who is lashing out at the world. This is a Batman who is not here to save his enemies. He's not here to empathize with them. He's here to deal out the punishment because he thinks it's going to make him feel better. And just like we saw in the Batman in Caped Crusader, Bruce has a very strained relationship with Alfred, and I know this has been the topic of discussion among many people who disliked this show. But I actually think the dynamic between Bruce and Alfred in this show is really interesting, and it's worthwhile. It's something that I think is very emotional, and it unfolds very organically to the point where by the time we reach the end of the show, it feels like a very cathartic resolution for these two characters. Caped Crusader is not very interested in being similar to BTAS. And what I mean by that is Caped Crusader is very much a show that does not want to portray its villains in a sympathetic light. I think when people think of BTAS, a reason to be clear, that they remember it so fondly is because this show pretty much gave them the definitive versions of so many iconic Batman characters, such as Clayface, Poison Ivy, Harley Quinn, and for some, even the Joker. So when they think about BTAS and what it did for the character, what it did for the mythology of Batman, I think it comes with a lot of nostalgia. It comes with a lot of emotional connection to certain characters. One of the major sort of motifs that you see in BTAS is this constant choice to make the villains of that show these very flawed and tragic characters. There's always a layer of understanding their pain or their trauma at the heart of certain episodes, but BTAS never goes so far as to say glorify that pain or even the horrific acts that someone like Clayface may commit, because the fact is there is no amount of hurt in the world that can justify doing some of the things that are done in BTAS. Whereas Caped Crusader takes the opposite approach. It is not interested in humanizing Batman's villains, rather it is trying to communicate these characters through a lens of essentially them being irredeemable and completely despicable. Some people are not a fan of that. I would encourage you to watch the show for yourself and come up with your own opinion. But for me, I think this decision works, and the reason I think it works is because the entirety of Caped Crusader to me feels like the showrunners and the creators and the producers, they wanted to tell new stories using the classic ideas and concepts of the Batman mythology, but in order to do so they had to significantly reimagine some of the characters and some of the backstory of these characters. In many cases, I think these new interpretations of certain characters are actually quite clever, because they are purposely designed to create narrative parallels or inversions that the audience finds ironic and would typically only associate with something like an episode that is maybe a one-off that involves traveling to an alternate universe, or an episode that is strictly an Elseworlds story, or maybe even a multiverse story. But in the spirit of being fair and unbiased, I can admit that some of these characters are a little bit thin in terms of their overall writing. They are not entirely the same three-dimensional characters that maybe most people wanted, as this has been a common criticism of the show as well. But I will say, the reason I think the change regarding the framing of the villains in Caped Crusader is appropriate, especially for 2024, is because Caped Crusader is very much approaching the Batman mythos through a modern lens. And what I mean by that is it has a sense of self-awareness, and that self-awareness means that the show is essentially trying to make it clear that sometimes it is obvious when there is a good side and there is an evil side. That said, it doesn't mean that there's no room for gray area. There absolutely is. For example, Barbara is portrayed as a very black and white individual in the sense that she believes in right and wrong, and there's no real shades of gray when it comes to her job. And then later in the season, there's an instance where she finds herself fighting for someone who very much appears to be in the wrong. And she naturally receives some pushback for her dad, and this forces her to sort of reconcile with her previous conception of the world. So there is nuance here. There are layers to the characters and the themes that are explored in Caped Crusader, but I can understand some of the criticisms about the characters being maybe a little underwritten and not explored as much as they could have been. Caped Crusader is very much a slow burn. It is a show that starts off slow. It doesn't quite make a big impression on the audience, but as the season progresses, it becomes clear what this season is about, as there is a very obvious dramatic through line and thematic basis that this show wants to explore, rather than being specifically about Bruce Wayne and his crime-fighting mission, or about these villains that were flawed people who became monsters through no fault of their own. Caped Crusader is a show that's more interested in the power structure of Gotham. It's more interested in the class struggle. It's more interested in the politics of this city and the corruption that plagues it. I think this is something that you see and realize it's very similar to the Batman. In many ways, there's just so many thematic parallels between this show and the Batman. In some regards, I can almost see that maybe this show is a sort of testing ground for concepts that they might want to explore in sequels for the Batman. Suffice it to say, despite the fact that this first season is a little bit of a slow burn, I think it does pick up and it becomes very clear what the show is about as you reach the latter half of the season. That's not to say that it's perfect. I do think the show has issues with its pacing and with its sort of distribution of time with the characters. I don't think the show has quite figured out how to balance the time between certain characters, because it is obvious that there are our main characters, which is obviously Batman, and then we have some supporting characters that do appear regularly throughout the show. The only characters that are true one-offs are the villains for each respective episode, which sort of highlights that they are not as interested in characterizing the villains as understandable people, similar to the way that they were in BTAS. We have a main cast of characters, and I think the show does struggle to allocate its time properly between those characters, which means some story beats, some character moments can feel rushed. I do want to be fair about this. The pacing of the season could have been better. Like I said, the first episode doesn't leave much of a strong impression at all, but by the second episode I found myself really getting into it because I personally dug what they did with Clayface. I also think this show has an interesting balance of the grounded side of Batman with the more supernatural aspects, because there are episodes that are clearly more willing to delve into that side of the character. The episode with the Gentleman Ghost is actually one of the most interesting and character-rich moments in the entire season, because I think it actually goes a long way in terms of developing Bruce, Alfred, and the overarching theme of the season. Then there's another episode later in the season which involves Batman going to a circus and searching for a bunch of kids that have been abducted, and all of them are named after different Robins. It's a nice little Easter egg to the comics, And you'll find that throughout this show. But I think that's another standout episode that really focuses on the more supernatural side of Batman. And I think the show balances these things fairly well, actually, because it is sort of willing to dip its toes in the fantastical, but it clearly is leaning more on the grounded side. Because, as I said at the beginning, I think rather than trying to be a spiritual successor, an evolution, or a sequel to BTAS, Batman Caped Crusader is just trying to evoke the feeling of watching BTAS. It wants to give you the vibe, and I think the way that it does that is by doubling down on the noir tone, and Caped Crusader really has that strong noir tone, and I think that's another reason for this 1940s aesthetic, is it just fits that time. That was the golden age of film noir, like Double Indemnity. So it's easy to see why those choices were made, and you even see that reflected in the musical choices. It may not be as iconic or instantly recognizable as Shirley Walker, but the music that is in Caped Crusader, I think, is very effective and very fitting for this show and what it's trying to do and the story it wants to tell. It's very seedy. It's very understated. It's reminiscent of something like Chinatown. And I think that's very appropriate for this show, and I think it all works. It coalesces into something that is a very strong tonal piece, which, speaking about the look specifically, brings us to the animation. This movie does not necessarily operate with the same style of animation as BTAS, and it shouldn't. It's 2024. Instead, I think Caped Crusader decides to go more for clarity. As we see more, we're able to see the action clearly. We're able to see everything that happens in the frame with extreme clarity, rather than relying so much on the use of shadows or sort of drawing from a point of black the way that they did in BTAS. Whether or not you prefer the look in Caped Crusader or BTAS, again, that's going to be completely up to you. That's going to be a subjective decision. But does it work for this show? I think it does. At times, the animation feels a little flat. It doesn't feel quite as inspired as BTAS. But overall, I think it's beautifully animated. I think it's very clear. I think it looks good. And given what the budget was for this show, I think it makes perfect sense. It is a good-looking show. The music sounds good. It really nails that noir tone. But all of this really doesn't matter unless the heart of the show works. And obviously the heart of the show is Bruce Wayne and Batman. And again, I think it does work. It worked for me. I will confess that when I first watched Caped Crusader, I had this feeling that, well, I've seen this before, and I've seen this before in the Batman, because this Bruce is very much portrayed as deeply troubled. He's clearly very affected by the death of his parents, and why wouldn't he be? If we're taking this more grounded approach, it is realistic to think that if a child saw his parents murdered right in front of his eyes at the age of 8, that is going to have a profound effect on his life. And he is probably not going to be a fully functioning adult in the healthiest sense. What I found interesting specifically about this portrayal of Bruce Wayne is that it pushes back against a lot of the common criticisms of the character. In my opinion, one of the most asinine takes in all of Batman is, well, why doesn't Bruce Wayne just use his money to fix the institutional problems in Gotham instead of dressing up as a bat and beating up poor people? That is the dumbest, most uncritical thought you could have about Batman. I'm sorry. It just goes to show that you don't know anything about either the character or the stories of Batman. Bruce Wayne is constantly donating his money to causes that should benefit the city, but the comics and Caped Crusader by extension understands that there are not simple answers to the problems that plague Gotham City. In a similar vein, this show realizes that this sort of weird criticism about Bruce Wayne just needing to go to therapy instead of doing what he does, it wouldn't necessarily fix everything, because there is an episode where Bruce goes to therapy, and it's actually really interesting. I think the dynamic between him and, I'm just going to say it, spoiler warning, I think the dynamic between him and Harleen Quinzel is really interesting. Being able to see Bruce in that clinical environment where he is supposed to be receiving the one thing that this lame pop culture criticism says would fix all of his emotional problems, it's interesting to watch him navigate that. His relationship with Alfred is admittedly not the best, but because we see this Bruce actually grow over the course of the season through episodes like specifically that episode involving the Gentleman's Ghost, which has a huge plot point around which Alfred shows that he is willing to sacrifice his life for Bruce because he loves him. That goes a long way in terms of developing their relationship. And then you see Bruce mature throughout the season, not only through his mission as Batman, but through his life as Bruce Wayne. I think that's what makes this portrayal so interesting to me, is it's not one note. This Bruce Wayne is able to grow because he participates in both sides of his life. He is trying to get his footing as Batman, but he also realizes that he has obligations as Bruce. And when he fails those obligations on either side of his life, he realizes this is an opportunity for me to learn. This is an opportunity for me to grow. And he does. So I think this is a very worthwhile portrayal of the character. Specifically in the final 2 episodes, we see a really interesting portrayal of Bruce Wayne, where he is sort of trying to wrestle with this newfound sense of guilt because he feels like he's failed another person that is important to him. Obviously, he does not want to make the same kind of mistake, even though it wasn't his fault when his parents died. He doesn't want to go through that again. It's just interesting to see him navigate that. So we're going to end this off with Hamish Linklater's performance as Bruce Wayne. I think it's fantastic. I really do. I think he does a great job. He is doing what is, in my opinion, a clear homage to Kevin Conroy, but he is also pulling from Robert Pattinson's performance by giving Batman this sort of low-register, emphatic whisper. It has more of a gravel to it, but there is a clear distinction between his voice as Bruce Wayne and his voice as Batman. I think he walks that line very well. I think Hamish Linklater is able to inject just the right amount of levity into Bruce Wayne when he's trying to channel this playboy persona. I think there's a fantastic joke with Bruce on a yacht party in the first episode. It worked for me. And Linklater is able to give Bruce Wayne some nuance. He's able to give him some three-dimensionality, because even though the script is not nearly as emotionally charged as BTAS, it's clear that Linklater and the showrunners understand the journey that they wanted Bruce to go on, and I think Linklater does a fantastic job at doing so. He really brings us in to the psyche of Bruce Wayne, and I think that's what makes Caped Crusader a worthwhile endeavor. Is Batman the Animated Series is a classic, unforgettable, beautiful representation of the character. Of course it is. But Batman Caped Crusader is every bit as interesting. It's every bit as worthwhile, and it is the first, in my opinion, true, genuine exploration of the psyche of Bruce Wayne since Batman Mask of the Phantasm in an animated project. And at a time when animation is constantly being devalued, I think it's important that Caped Crusader has come along and said, hey, we can tell mature, emotional, morally complicated stories with animation. And that's why I liked Batman Caped Crusader. It is a good Batman show. It understands the character despite what many people have said. I do think there are fair criticisms. It's not perfect, but I encourage you all to watch it for yourself and form your own opinion. Thank you for watching, everybody. If you enjoyed the review, I would ask you to please like the video and consider subscribing. Otherwise, I wish you all the best. Take care. Peace. Plants. Namaste.